And welcome to our next lecture on employee engagement, part of the Managing People and Organisations module. Today, as I said, we're going to be focusing on employee engagement, and this is what I'm going to try and cover today. So what do we mean by employee engagement? What influences it? Some common criticisms of it, and what do organisations do who want to actually improve their employee engagement? And this is a term you've probably heard me use in the workshops because it's linked to other subjects that we've studied in this module, such as a psychological contract and motivation theories as well, not least how managers have to manage. So moving on then to start looking at a definition. Well, this is part of the problem because there is no definition of employee engagement that's commonly agreed upon. There are lots of different attempts of it. There are attempts that are used in sort of academic literature. There are also attempts to define it that are used by organisations like the CIPD. We've come across some of their work on a regular basis. And when you look at some of the academic literature, you'll see this problem, this idea that there's no real agreement on what we're actually talking about. So that's a challenging issue for organisations who want to do some work in this space. But as you can see on the screen, linked to other ideas that we looked at, like motivation, job satisfaction, so how much do people like their jobs, and this idea called organisational commitment, which is what it suggests. How committed is somebody to their role or to their broader organisation. It's sometimes described as a psychological state, something that employees experience. You're either engaged or you're not engaged. There's an organisation called Engage for Success, and a few years ago now, the government actually commissioned them to do quite a big piece of research into employee engagement and the state of it and what does it mean and what drives it. And they produced a really comprehensive report. As I said, so it's a little dated now. I think it was 2008, 2009. But it's still quite an influential document in the field. And this is how they define employee engagement. So they're really coming at it from a workplace perspective rather than that psychological state and what employees feel. So they say, as you can see on the screen, a workplace approach resulting in the right conditions for all members of an organisation to give their best each day. They're committed to their organisation's goals and values, motivated to contribute to organisational success with an enhanced sense of their own well-being. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? And I'm not sure it's a definition I like that much, if I'm honest, because I think it is a little bit wordy and what does that really mean anyway? And I think there's a bigger question, like, do we want or need everybody to go to work and give their best every single day? Is that what good looks like? Those of you that have your workshops with me, you'll know I'm a little bit cynical sometimes about some of these ideas and concepts. I kind of like the Gallup's definition a lot more, if I'm honest. I think it's a bit more straightforward, a bit more easy to understand. And they just simply say the involvement and enthusiasm of employees in their work and their workplace. And if you haven't heard of Gallup before, they are a surveying organisation, and one of the things they do is they survey engagement all over the globe and produce reports every year on the state of engagement. So, you know, what's that looking like at a sort of global and national type level? So I think that idea of involvement and enthusiasm probably works a little bit better for me than the first one. I don't know what you think. But the first person who ever used the term actually was called Kahn, and he wrote a paper in the 1990s in the Academy of Management Journal. And it was, the term really took off. He used it to describe, you can see his definition on the screen there, how people express themselves physically, cognitively, and emotionally. So for him, it's all about the individual, and it's about how they show up, how they behave. So really different from that idea of it's a workplace approach, which you also get from the CIPD. And again, you can see his idea there was it's like, it's this internal state, it's how we feel. And I think that makes good sense. It's got what we call good face value, isn't it? We have a good idea about how we feel about the work that we do, and how we feel about it shows up in what we do. If you do any reading about employee engagement for your assignment, you might come across these ideas of discretionary effort or going the extra mile. So discretionary effort meaning simply, you're putting in a bit more effort than technically maybe you are required to do. And that presents some interesting questions for people in this field, which is, should we be asking people to give discretionary effort? Should we be asking people to go the extra mile, to work harder? And if so, what for? Or should we really just be doing what's expected of us, doing what we're paid to do, and fulfilling our job description? So there's two different views there. I once saw somebody say on social media that discretionary effort is theft. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but I can see where they're coming from. This idea that actually we should just be paying people to do their job. We shouldn't be also saying to them, show up and be even more amazing and do extra and do more with perhaps a bit of a promise that you'll get something for that, some intangible reward maybe in the future. So I think that's quite an interesting argument. I'll let you make up your own mind on that one. But moving forward then to have a look at again, more ideas on what do we even mean by this idea of engagement. So I've got a couple of other perspectives to share with you. So you can see another one here, which is defining work engagement, they call it, rather than employee engagement. Again, possibly slightly different emphasis there, but again, a state of mind where employees show vigour, dedication and absorption. So you can see all sorts of definitions there, what they mean by that. So you're showing energy in your work, enthusiasm, inspiration, pride, you're engrossed in it. Well, I kind of get what they're saying. An employee who is really, really engaged with their work, engaged with their organisation, maybe their role, they may well do these things. I think my question is, like, how realistic is that for most people, most of the time? Think about the jobs you've got. Even if you really like your job, do you truly show up with energy and enthusiasm and inspiration and pride every day? Is that even a realistic thing to hope for? If you were a manager or you worked in human resources or you were a CEO and you wanted employee engagement, does that sound like something you are realistically going to be able to get from your employees on a daily basis? I'm not entirely sure. I think it's really possible to like your job, but not necessarily show some of the things that are on this slide here. There's also a dark side sometimes to engagement around this idea of, well, you can like your job too much, and you can put in too much enthusiasm and too much energy, and actually there can be a flip side to that. We'll talk more about that later on. And then another idea, again, you can see the reference there from this paper at the bottom of the screen. It's from Ashridge Executive Education. And they came up with this, what I think is quite an interesting idea. And they said that employees fit into one of these 3-4 zones that you can see here. So there is a zone of disengagement. So this would be quite an unhealthy culture. We've talked a little bit about organisational cultures along the way in some of the seminars. You can see there might be tension, there might be gossip, it might be fairly toxic. People don't feel listened to, they might not feel psychologically safe, or they can be honest with each other. And then you've got this idea of people who are content. So at the top left of your screen. So they're reasonably happy, they like the way that they work. There is, general overall people are just okay. They're not necessarily showing that vigor and that energy and that enthusiasm and that pride that our previous definition looked at. But they will come up with new ways of doing things. They will work together reasonably well. I think that's probably more of a likely state for most organisations most of the time. In the bottom right, you've got this idea of pseudo engagement. So you've got a group of people, they happen to work together. We've had that conversation, haven't we, about the difference between groups and teams. People a bit more focused on their own needs than the needs of the team. They're not going to go out of their way to help each other out particularly. There are some negatives potentially in this culture. Managers might not be particularly effective or particularly caring about their organisation. So, maybe looks all right on the surface, maybe kind of scratch that surface, and it's not perhaps the most healthy of cultures. And you might have some stress and things going on there as well. And then you've got this idea of the zone of engagement. And this is where people are really happy with their work. They're working together. They're a really effective team. They can be honest and open with each other. They can be positive role models. There's respect, there's inclusion, there's all of that good stuff. So really, I think this argument is you can have sort of all of these different things going on, potentially even in the same organisation. You can have, a team in the same business that is in different parts of these spaces. And part of something like this is it's a bit of a tool for managers to think about, like, where are your team? For those of you that have got jobs at the moment, it might be able for you to say, which one of those 4 boxes that your own work team fits into. But I think quite an interesting idea, and I like this one. It's a bit more, I think, feels a bit more real than perhaps some of this idea of we can really get that inspiration and that vigor all the time. Here's another idea, and this is from Management Today, a publication that looked at this idea of the circle of engagement. So this is sort of, how does it actually happen in practice? And you can see there we've got this idea of engagement just sort of being mutually reinforcing if all of the right things are in place. So if we've got the conditions of engagement, that will feed into employees feeling engaged, which leads to an engaged company. And we go round and round in a sort of virtuous circle there. And again, that seems to make sense, doesn't it? If employees are happy, the company does well, they're happy to invest in employees and maybe benefits, and the employee gets more happy, and we can go around in this really, really positive way. Now, the article didn't consider this particularly, but you could see it could work the other way as well, couldn't you? So if the conditions for engagement aren't there, if you treat people poorly, if your benefits are poor, if you're not paying a decent wage, if you don't support learning and development, if you don't try and motivate your people or manage them well, that it would lead into a disengaged employee, which will have negative business outcomes. And we go around the circle in the same way, but in a negative way rather than a positive way. So we've got a bit of an idea of what employee engagement is. Now let's have a look at some of the criticisms of it. And one of the big criticisms of employee engagement is that this term that was invented by Kahn in the 90s suddenly became this really great way of making a lot of money for management consultancies, who kind of seized on the term and repackaged some old ideas. That's what this criticism means when I say old wine in new bottles. So if we look at things like job satisfaction, motivation, well, these theories, as you've seen, because we've talked about them, some of them have been around for decades. We've been looking at how do we motivate people to do a good job, right since the start of management really as a discipline. We've gone right back, haven't we, to scientific management and Taylor and all those really old factory styles of managing people. And some people say, look, employee engagement, it's nothing new. It's basically the same thing. It's just giving it a new fancy word. And now we've got something new to talk about. HR teams are busy talking about employee engagement. It's no different really to job satisfaction. Some of the definitions are a little bit different, but I think this is a really interesting point. Is this something really new at all? Another criticism of employee engagement as a concept, as a field, is this idea of like, well, what's in it for me? If I'm an employee, what's in it for me to be engaged? And again, this is where that sort of slightly cynical view comes in, which says, should we be asking people to go that extra mile? Should we be saying to people, put some discretionary effort? And actually, most employees, they just want to go to work and do their job. They don't necessarily want to be engaged by an employer. They don't want to participate in some of this activity and some of the other things that come out the back of it, which I'll talk about in a moment, like surveys and so on. So again, that's a sort of more employee-centric view. But despite some of the criticisms I've mentioned, organisations are quite focused on employee engagement. It's a big ticket item for lots of them. And why? Because we've got this kind of theory, this happy worker theory, that if employees are healthy, they'll be happier. If they're engaged, they'll be happy. That, you know, we get this virtual circle again. You know, if we've got engaged employees, they'll be fulfilled, they'll be motivated, they'll work hard, that'll lead to organisational performance. Customers will be happier, productivity will go through the roof, we'll have loads of innovation, nobody will ever leave, and we'll have lots of positive health and safety. That's the theory. Is it true? Well, the jury's out a little bit on that. Some people say yes, some people say no. There are different ideas coming through in the research. And what some people say is that we've got this really big issue with causation and correlation. So actually, if you do have an organisation where you've got happy people working there, you know, why are they happy? Are they happy because they like their work? For example, some people are engaged with their work, not their organisation. For example, let's say you're a nurse in the NHS. You might not love working for the NHS, but you might love being a nurse. So we get into all these sort of debates around what on earth are we talking about anyway? And what are people engaged with? And then we come to this challenge, which is, well, how do we know if people are engaged? If it's this kind of thing we're aiming for, even though we don't really know sometimes what that definition is, how do we measure it? Well, there are ways to measure it. And what most organisations do is a survey. So they send out surveys to their employees and they ask them questions, and they won't necessarily say how engaged are you. That's tend to, you know, people will answer that in different ways because they'll define it differently. But they'll ask questions that, in theory, will uncover whether people are satisfied at work, healthy at work, happy at work, etc. But as I say, you then get into this argument about causation or correlation, and that's really important thing to understand when you're studying, because sometimes people will claim all sorts of things with statistics, but can you actually demonstrate that the thing you're saying is caused by the thing that you're doing? That's a really inelegant way of saying, if you're working on employee engagement, if you're doing things to make your employees happier, whatever that looks like for your organisation, can you conclusively say it has made them happier or it hasn't? Or it has made them, for example, more well, or it has made us more inclusive. So this idea of, if we just got two things that are happening together, or is one thing like the employee engagement strategy or employee engagement activity, is it actually making people happier or more satisfied or more motivated? So, should you measure engagement? Well, I think it's a useful thing to do. And one of the reasons for that is it's a really, really common phrase, but what gets measured gets attention, or what gets measured gets done is another way of saying that. So if you're saying we're going to do some stuff on engagement, you know, that's a useful way potentially of getting some budget, of getting some employee buy-in, some executive buy-in. So, you know, it can be a good thing in and of itself. If you're seeking feedback from employees, if you're doing surveys, it can give you good insight into how people feel. And, you know, we call that employee voice. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. And we know from Engaged Success that in its own right, talking to employees and getting their involvement and getting their input can actually drive employee engagement. Can also help inform decision making. So, you know, if people are telling you, you know, we're not happy with something, it can help you make decisions about how to make changes in your organisation. One of the big challenges is, you know, you need a robust measure, you need to have clear data, you need to have a well-designed survey, and you need to make sure you're measuring what you think you are measuring as well. And it's really easy to put a survey together. Anybody can put a survey together, but making sure you're asking questions in the right way to get the answers that you want without bias, without leading people, etc., is a skill in and of itself. So that's why a lot of organisations do use specialist organisations. But of course, if you're doing something like a survey, it's only ever a snapshot of one moment in time, and things do change in an organisation. I've been a little bit critical perhaps thus far, but there is evidence that says when you have employees who are engaged, that does correlate with better performance. Whether it causes it is another question entirely. So I mentioned Gallup earlier, and this is how they measure engagement. So they have these 12 questions. They're copyrighted, by the way, so you're not actually allowed to go and use them yourself without their formula behind it. And of course, they don't publish that, but they do ask these 12 questions. And they argue that this is one of the best ways. If you put all of these things together, it can help you have a really good snapshot picture of your organisation. Some of these make real sense to me. How satisfied are you overall with your company as a place to work? Do you know what's expected of you at work? Do you have the tools you need to do your job properly? Do you get recognition? Does your supervisor care about you? The one I find quite interesting is I have a best friend at work. I've always been a little bit unsure about that question, but Gallup think it's really important. And it's this idea, of course, of sort of social engagement and bonds in the workplace. And actually, when I was in practice, I spent years doing employee engagement surveys, despite my cynicism about them. And very often when you say to people, what's the best thing about working here? Overwhelmingly, they say, I've got friends at work or the people that I work with. So it is really influential to people. So I don't know how you would answer that about the organisations that you currently work for, but maybe one day you'll be asked to answer one of Gallup's surveys where you work. So I've talked a bit about Gallup assessing the global view of engagement. They think only 32% of employees are engaged. That's a US survey, but it doesn't differ that much when they look at their global surveys either. But they also say if you've got an organisation that's doing best practice work on employee engagement, so really focus on it, having the right HR policies, having good reward, good learning, good motivation, good managers, and all the other things we've talked about so far on this module, then you can really shift that needle from hovering at around a third to 2/3. And they say that's like the difference between being really good at engagement stuff and doing nothing. Some UK data from the CIPD. Just over half of workers feel enthusiastic about their jobs. 1 in 3 feel full of energy, and just over half are willing to work harder than they are required to do, which is an interesting way to look at engagement. So back to that report that I mentioned earlier, which is the McLeod review. So this is the Engage for Success report and research. And they identified that there are 4 key enablers of employee engagement. So they said if you've got good leaders who give a strong strategic narrative about the organisation, so there's a vision, this is where we're going, this is where how you play your part in this, that will enable engagement. Good line managers, we've talked about that, and we've identified in our seminars that that's a really powerful influence on how people feel at work. That you've got employee voice, so employees are engaged with feedback, they have opportunities to have their say and to input and make suggestions. And that the organisation has organisation integrity. Now that's interesting and a new topic for us. So this idea that values are reflected in the organisation. So I think you might have done some values work already in your employability modules. And therefore you'll have a bit of an idea of what we mean by values. But it's this idea that we've all got these things that matter to us, and organisations often have values too. So when that aligns and when organisations live their values and have organisation integrity, that's good for employee engagement. I think that all makes good common sense. Gallup have a slightly different view. This is what they say makes the difference on engagement. So you've got some meaning and purpose in your job, that you've got opportunities to develop. You might remember our video on motivation from Dan Pink, autonomy, mastery, purpose. So this is the mastery piece. A manager that cares about you. You have ongoing conversations at work around things like your performance and your development in your career, and you're able to utilise your strengths. So that's what Gallup say makes the difference in the workplace. Other things then that we know influence how engaged people are, and lots of crossover here between job satisfaction, motivation, and even well-being, some of the other things we've talked about along the way on this module so far. So your relationship with your manager, your own characteristics as an individual, what you're like as a person, the design of your job, so its resources and its demands, how much autonomy you have, the relationships you have with the people you work with, the extent to which the organisation that you work with, how that fits with you and your personality and your goals and your values, the experience of working there, which is different to engagement. So how am I treated, for example? And that can be quite basic things like bottom of Maslow's triangle. Am I paid on time? You know, is it a nice place to work? Is the office okay if I'm in an office? Have I got the equipment that I need, and so on? And then what is the broader organisational culture like? But out of all of these, and we've seen a statistic not too dissimilar to this previously in our Manager Week, that 70% of the variance in team engagement is determined solely by the manager. So if you go on to be a manager, never underestimate the importance of your role in terms of your team and how they feel. A hugely important aspect. Good management kind of underpins everything, as I think we've seen so far in the module. So where does that sort of kick in then? Certain leadership styles are seen to have a better impact on engagement than others. So ideas around transformational leadership, authentic leadership, supportive leadership, we talked about all of these in level 4. But particularly managers who support employees to grow, who are fair, who are consistent, who are honest. If there's problems in the team, they jump on them, they deal with them. And they also make it really, really clear to employees what's expected of them. So if you can do those things as a manager, the theory goes, you should get good employee engagement. So we've looked at a couple of these criticisms of employee engagement along the way, but we've got this lack of agreement of what it is. It's an umbrella term. It means lots of different things to different people. And then we've got all this different competing academic evidence. And that makes a bit of a problem sometimes. If you want to go and talk, for example, you work in human resources and you want to go and talk to a leader and say, we want to do some work on employee engagement, they're probably going to say to you, well, what is it? And what do you mean by it? And what does that look like? And what's your business case for it? So it can be quite difficult when we don't even really always know how to define it. And then we have this idea of engage with what. So if I'm engaged, am I engaged with my manager, with my job, with my company? What is it? And if I answer a survey in a really, really positive way, for example, if I think about my job, is that because I think LJMU is amazing? Is that because I love my students? Is that because I think the Business With course is fantastic? Or do I just really, really like my boss? So it's really difficult, isn't it, to kind of really understand those points around causation and correlation. Challenges with measuring it, inconsistent advice about how we actually achieve it. And the other thing we know is that generally, like, engagement's kind of stable. Your personality comes into play here. If you're a genuinely happy person or generally maybe a bit of a negative personality, that's how you roll. Can you really influence people? Can you really shift the needle and make them suddenly more engaged or more vigorous or more energetic or some of those other words that we've heard? So, not easy. Couple of things that we do know though is that quick fixes don't shift engagement. So giving people a quick bonus or, you know, putting on a very short-term piece of learning and development or something like that doesn't shift the dial. It needs a lot of concerted effort, and these kind of individual initiatives again don't deliver a lot. What people really need is like a holistic program. You have to look at engagement at a broad level. You have to look at all those different levers, all those different influences if you really want to make people more engaged in your organisation. That can take time, and it's not easy, it's not quick, and it might not be cheap. So to try and pull this together then, there are different ideas about what engagement is and how you make employees engaged. There's even a question about, like, should we? Linked to ideas about motivation, satisfaction, psychological contract, all of which we've talked about already. But as a concept, it does come into some criticism. Despite that, and despite the problems, it's still of considerable interest to organisations. They spend time on it, they spend money, and they're very happy to do lots of surveys, certainly in some organisations. So definitely worthwhile pursuing. There are business benefits, but like anything, we should pursue it with keeping in mind all of those challenges too. So you've got some personal learning tasks this week. I have included the Engage for Success report, and there is also an article to take a look at on employee engagement as well. So hopefully you'll find those useful, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the workshops this week to talk about this subject in a little bit more depth. See you then.